Some of the issues, I'm Mike, by the way, I'm Mike Watza from Detroit, Michigan. I'm a regulatory attorney, specialized in litigation, I like to think, on all of these issues. So, all right. So we're going to talk about, should DAS and small cells appear in the right-of-way, or should they be on private property? Does the business model of a provider justify use of the limited space in a right-of-way? And if it's going in the right-of-way, can we minimize the pole proliferation that I know my clients are concerned about primarily by requiring co-location on existing electric poles or other such existing structures? And then if it's going to be in the right-of-way, what are some of the reasonable regulations that we can offer in order to control our right-of-way? Start with fees, the upfront fees. We're seeing on a regular basis that the DAS small cell community are submitting applications that maybe lack some clarity in putting cities, townships, counties, villages to an awful lot of work. And so there's an increasing discussion about maybe we need to up our fees so that we're not going in the hole for what is their business. Also, engineering costs, planning, and of course, my favorite, legal. And then, what's a reasonable rent from month to month or year to year? What should the term of the agreement be? How long will this immediately needed technology be relevant? And then bonds, insurance, indemnity, and so on. And then finally, for our first speaker, what is the current status, what is the current status of the National Programmatic Agreement per the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, and how does it impact wireless facilities on public property? And to address whatever issues he cares to, we have Dan Abeyta. Dan has been with the FCC since 1983. He's the Chief Assistant of the Wireless Bureau Spectrum and Competition Policy Division. Staff is responsible for ensuring all wireless facilities comply with the Commission's environmental regulations, implementing the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, just in case you wonder why I teed that discussion up. He has held various positions at the FCC since '83, including the Enforcement Division of the former Mass Media Bureau, the Mobile Services and Tariffs Division of the former Common Carrier Bureau, and he holds a BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of Wyoming, a JD from Syracuse University, and an MBA from George Washington University. And I think I will go ahead, so that I don't have to get up and bother any of you, I will go ahead and introduce the other two speakers who will speak in the following order. Our next speaker is Karen Sessions. Karen is a 27-year veteran of Verizon, where, without going through all of the things she did there, clearly a top-level policy management person for Verizon for those years, being in charge of, for instance, smart cities, telematics, Internet of Things, transportation, machine-to-machine, healthcare, energy security, and cybersecurity. I don't think there's anything else that could be listed. She's presently with 5 bars, communities. I think it's 5 bar communities. And I'll let her tell you what that's all about. But it sounds like they're trying to assist maybe both sides of the aisle on this effort to roll out the small cells and DAS. Karen holds a finance degree from the University of Notre Dame. I'm a Michigan Stater, and we've already forgiven each other for this past weekend. She also holds a master's from the University of South Florida. And then finally, someone who you're all very familiar with, Mayor Gary Resnick of Wilton Manors, Florida. Also a shareholder in his own law firm in Fort Lauderdale. He has been recognized as one of the top lawyers in the state of Florida for telecommunications and represents local government, educational, and other governmental institutions. He is chair of the Federal Communications Commission's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee, which just issued a report not very long ago, and he may talk about that. Testified before the U.S. Senate and serves on the National League of Cities, Technology and Communications Policy Committee, and the NLC's Legal Advisory Committee. Active with the Florida League. In the past, he's been on the board of directors of the Florida League of Mayors, the president of the Broward County League of Cities, and he is a graduate of Bucknell University up in Pennsylvania. I have a nephew there. And he has a JD from Rutgers, another school that we'll be talking about later in the football season. So with that, I get out of the way and let these fine folks do their piece.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Dan Abeyta. I've been with the FCC 33 years. Been a great agency to work with. It doesn't look anything like it did when I started. I started out doing mass media, television, radio, and that area was the booming area. And now we've got the world tipped upside down. So anyway, I want to start off by thanking Steve Trailer and the members of NATOA for inviting the FCC's Wireless Bureau to be with you today. The FCC and the Bureau are proud of their relationship with NATOA. As a matter of fact, we just met with Steve last week. And when Steve calls, it's like the Merrill Lynch, whatever. When he calls, the FCC listens. He has a great reputation. He has a lot of ideas, and we always welcome NATOA's input on any of the issues that we're working on. Well, it should come as no surprise to anyone that infrastructure and siting have taken center stage at the FCC. For years, infrastructure and siting were the poor brother and sister, the black sheep of the family when it came to FCC issues. No longer. Now they're on the front page. We've all witnessed that movement from cell phones, from voice to smartphones, to voice and data over the years that we rely on for our smartphones. We're at the FCC and the industry, we're witnessing a movement from the macro cells, the tall cell towers that we've seen all over the country, a movement from those to smaller cells, smaller technology, to microcells, to DAS, distributed antenna systems. And if that wasn't enough, I'm sure everyone here heard FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler's cry, "Here comes 5G." And his message there is, it's coming, it's on the way. It's not something in the distant future. There are teams of industry engineers and others who are working on 5G to make it a reality. So all of us have to be aware of that movement to 5G. There's a lot that we can do, and it starts with collaboration. We need to be able to sit down, listen to each other, get a sense of what is this new technology that's coming and how should we prepare for it. So I'd like to spend a few moments talking about what is 5G. Zach Champ with We, I think you discussed a little bit of that, but I want to go into it a little bit just for those of you who are not familiar with it. And what is 5G? What are the benefits of 5G to the localities? And why should localities consider streamlining their infrastructure review processes to prepare for 5G? Then I want to share with you some of the steps that the FCC has taken to streamline its review processes in anticipation of 5G, in preparation for the movement from smaller towers to smaller towers. So we're under the same initiative, we're under the same time frames, or at least the same constraints to be able to be adaptive and to make changes to our rules as well. 5G wireless is going to be capable of high data rates, ultra-high reliability, high energy efficiency, low latency, and it will be able to support massive numbers of devices such as smartphones, laptops, software equipment that you're going to be able to use to control the lighting or the air conditioning or some of the infrastructure within your buildings. 5G is going to be developed on the LTE platform, which we're currently using. We're currently using either 3G or 4G, so it's going to start off by being built on that platform in a combination with new radio technologies that may not even exist today. As Chairman Wheeler said, the three keys to 5G are spectrum, siting, and infrastructure. On the spectrum side, we all realize that there is a shortage of spectrum. It's like land. There's only so much. There's spectrum that we haven't been able to use that's either too high or too low. There's spectrum that is being used, but it's being used by other stakeholders outside of our wireless commercial areas. So the FC is working to lead the way in this availability, both all low band, medium band, and high band spectrum, which we're going to need all of it for 5G. The Commission has been working to make this spectrum available through its incentive auctions, which we're currently working on now, and by making program experimental licenses available to conduct field tests on 5G. Now, with this 5G, one thing is clear. We're going to need new infrastructure. We're going to need new towers. We're going to need thousands of new towers. We're moving from the broad spectrum that has been spread by the large towers to a large area to smaller areas where those of us who are on the street and on the ground need to be able to access data immediately, whether we're inside a building or we're walking, we're working at our desk, or wherever. But to do that, we're going to need smaller towers or smaller infrastructure that's going to be co-located on other facilities. This infrastructure is going to make use of the right-of-ways. It's going to be placed on light poles, the tops of utility poles, traffic poles. So all of this infrastructure, the taller infrastructure, the macro as well as the micro, is going to be working together to provide the services that all of us are going to be using in 5G. To be sure, 5G is going to require new tower construction. So it's not going to be all co-locations. So you're going to be looking at new applications that are going to be coming in. Some of the information that we've received indicates that these towers are going to range anywhere from 35 feet to 50 feet or somewhere in that area. So they're not going to be as large as the old towers that we had in the past. The other part of this 5G is going to be backhaul. Backhaul is where all this information needs to be connected. It needs to be sent back to the network, needs to be repackaged. Backhaul is the connectivity that's going to require the use of dark fiber between towers, cable, perhaps some microwave back and forth, the use of T1 or T3 lines. So it's going to be using all the technology that's out there to put everything together. So from the perspective of the localities, I think one of the questions that you should ask is, what does 5G mean for the localities? What are the benefits of 5G to NATOA members? Well, as I explained, 5G is the future of wireless. It's going to be available everywhere and anywhere. 5G is going to work with existing fiber to deliver broadband benefits to communities, to homeowners, to businesses. We'll be deploying antennas for 5G for coverage in all areas, rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas. So it's not just going to be a question of have and have-nots. One of the initiatives of the agency's initiatives is eliminating the digital divide so that these broadband services, particularly 5G, will be available to all. And probably the most important question is, why should the localities consider streamlining the review process for 5G and for related services? Well, as I said, one is eliminating the digital divide, which is going to allow our communities, our children, our localities to be able to use these services, especially in areas where they're lacking. 5G is going to reduce the costs of localities, or has the potential to reduce costs by optimizing smart cities, reducing utility costs by creating smart traffic patterns, and the much hyped driverless cars, which hopefully will help to decrease auto accidents. 5G will promote the use of sensors, which will turn objects into intelligent networks that collect data. And the analysis of the data should help elected officials and local administrators to gain a better understanding of their infrastructures and the infrastructure use. Localities are going to be able to expand and move products from local to national markets cheaper and more efficiently at real-time speeds. 5G will or should promote new business models and may increase the potential for new businesses and new employment. So as you can see, all of us will benefit from 5G. But 5G is going to involve unique, different sets of infrastructure needs. So it's important that all of us begin now to look at what is 5G going to look like and what we need to do to adapt, to modify our application or approval processes for siting applications. This is something that all of us have to take a look at, and hopefully we can do it sitting at the same table in some instances. As I indicated, the FCC has started the same process as the localities have, and that is looking at how we can further streamline our rules. When I first came to the Wireless Bureau, the big issue was the large towers that were shooting up like wildflowers all over. And it was initially the historic preservation communities that brought it to our attention. I'm proud to say that after several years of working with CTIA, PCIA, which is WIA now, working with the tower companies and the wireless industry, that we were able to draft rules such as the co-location agreement, the nationwide programmatic agreement, to address the issue of ensuring that the agency had rules that the industry was able to comply with. Since then, we've looked at our rules even more. In 2011, we adopted a pole attachment order, which streamlined wireless attachments on utility lines. We mandated access to the top of the poles to increase wireless broadband capacity. And we codified defined timelines between utility pole owners and broadband providers. We modified our Section 106 rules to streamline them to take into account certain DAS and small cell deployments that don't have an impact on historic properties or communities. These would be DAS small cells that are outside of the historic area. So the Commission has been extremely busy looking at what it can do to modify its rules. We're also we have a number of initiatives that are that we've worked on spectrum, how to open up spectrum at the higher levels. One of the areas that I'm proud to say that we have worked closely with NTOA is on, 2 workshops, Steve? We just did one workshop back in May. So with Steve's and NTOA's assistance, we brought together members of industry, engineers. We did case studies on how DAS and small cell have been used in different cities. For example, in San Francisco, Boston, and Philadelphia. And it was used in, like, on metro systems, in hospitals, colleges. So these are the kind of initiatives that I think we're going to be looking at in the future, is how the federal government, how the local governments and the wireless industry can get together, just like we've done with the small cell technology, and get in front of the issues we need to address. Future efforts, I think, would include having workshops that are focused on education. How do we educate stakeholders? How do we educate the localities in terms of, say, for example, what is 5G? What do the components look like? What is it going to be able to do for communities? These are the kind of things that we can start working on today. So, being part of this initiative, working with NTOA and the industry, is something that I'm looking forward to doing. I think it's something that we can continue to sit down at the table to discuss. Certainly the agency can do more in its area. I was talking to Mitzi, and she suggested that we do things like modify some of our siting websites so that they're more focused on the interests or the needs of the localities or citizens. So there's a lot that we could do as well. But I think we're going to need your input, not just telling you what to do, but inviting you to come in and listening to some of your suggestions. So as Chairman Wheeler has said, given the ever-increasing emphasis on infrastructure and siting issues, the question that we all should be asking ourselves is, how can the states, the federal and the local governments work together more effectively with the private sector to allow for the ever-growing number of antennas that are going to be needed, not only to allow us to continue our smartphone technologies, but to build out a broadband wireless public safety system, to develop smart cities and energy grids, safer transportation networks, and improved health care. Thank you.
We'll do questions at the end, if that's acceptable.
Yeah, I'm going to grab this.
Sure.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Sessions, and I am with a company called 5 Bars, which is located in California. And as previously stated, my background has been 27 years with Verizon in different assignments, both from leading business units to integration units and so forth. And then the last part of my assignment was in public policy, where we, at the time, and Verizon still, along with every other carrier, is contemplating what are the investments that the carrier should make when it comes to smart technologies and smart cities, transportation, energy, healthcare, and so forth. And at the underlying base of all of this is the connectivity. And for the public and the private sector to be able to place the right investments and have the projected efficiencies and results and so forth, we all are embracing the coming, of course, of 5G and having ubiquitous coverage in our cities. And as a little bit of a counterbalance to that, I was a commissioner and vice mayor in my city, and I served for 3 years, and we took a lead in improving public safety networks and emergency response networks and so forth. And at the time, which was almost 8 years ago, we were seeing all of this come, but now it is coming in a very, very big wave, and I would say that every one of you in the room here is seeing some demands on your time for this. So I would like to start in showing you just a little bit of a 2-minute video of what our firm does and the way that we look at the deployment of wireless infrastructure and the need for cities to be able to plan effectively to do a couple of things: maintain control, preserve the aesthetics of what's going on, and also create the environment where the investment can come to each city and be deployed effectively. So if you'd like to show the video quickly, and then we can carry on from there.
The need for cellular connectivity is growing at an accelerated pace, and the world is more connected than ever. Is your city ready to take advantage of the growing demand? Wireless carriers are changing their focus from large macro sites to small cell sites located on poles, real estate, and street furniture, dedicating billions of dollars for small cell technology to be placed on city assets and in the right of way. As carriers rush to expand their networks, permitting departments are inundated with small cell applications. The applications are submitted under the new federal shot clock guidelines, with some wireless providers demanding utility treatment. In other words, unattractive sites can be deployed in undesirable locations if the city does not process the application before the shot clock runs out. 5 Bars is here to relieve the pressure of small cell permitting, address visual blight, and accelerate revenue to the city. At no cost to the city, 5 Bars will create a wireless marketing plan to put your community on the map for wireless carriers. Our plan allows cities to maintain control of city assets and right-of-way by creating location, aesthetic, and pricing guidelines. Here's how it works. First, 5 Bars conducts an RF benchmark survey to locate gaps in wireless coverage throughout the city. Secondly, we inventory city assets, identify strategic locations like light poles, bus stops, and advertising kiosks that can be used for the installation of small cells in an aesthetically pleasing manner, which will fill inconvenient and annoying coverage gaps. 5 Bars markets the city pre-approved locations and approved form factors to the wireless carriers and negotiates monthly recurring revenue to be paid to the city. 5 Bars drives carrier revenue for the city and enhances coverage for the citizens. We work alongside the city in a revenue share model. We have no conflict of interest with cities. 5 Bars is an advocate for the city. We streamline the hundreds of small cell permit applications, allowing rapid deployment without increasing the workload of city staff. Enhance coverage, increase revenue, and relieve the permitting burden. Please contact us to better understand how we can help your city.
So where I'd like to start when we're talking about the deployment of small cell and infrastructure and how this all comes together, and the video reviewed it a little bit, but there's, in our point of view, in my point of view, is that there's a great need for a couple of things to come together. What particular municipal and county, state, whatever it may be, the assets that are available to support the demand for small cell deployment. And then secondly, how to do it in I'm going to call it a neutral way, where it benefits all the residents, all the citizens, and it's available to all the carriers. So it's carrier neutral, depending on what the carrier needs and where they need it and how they need it, that those two things match up, the asset inventory and then the availability of that to match up. And then third, what is the pricing and regulatory oversight that allows cities to maintain control and they allow to be able to deploy in an aesthetically pleasing way. So I had a couple of also slides that have some pictures. I'm not sure where our slide presentation, there we go. And what we do is, and how our point of view evolved, is we had a point of view where we're putting in infrastructure into stadiums, into buildings, into we've done toll road projects and so forth, and then we had a project that we are just commencing with the city of Sacramento, where there was a great need to, the same way that you would do a water management plan or a utility plan or what have you in your city. We think it's important to do a wireless master plan and bring together what the city has to offer, how it has to offer it, what the carrier needs, what the form factors could and should look like depending on the latest availability, and then thirdly, how to attract the infrastructure and the investment on city assets, which will naturally compete with the private assets, of which the traditional cell towers have been mostly deployed. And as Dan said, the numbers are staggering. When you look at the macro cell deployment, and there's 350,000 or so in the U.S., then there's going to be a need. The forecasts are 600,000 plus by 2020. What makes this all come together is for our cities to be planning and attracting this in the way that is important to your city, and be able to plan for it. There's another reason as well, is on the investment side, is the carriers have a lot of infrastructure to deploy to support what the demand is out there, specifically, of course, in wireless. And there's somewhere upwards of $37 billion that'll be deployed out through the U.S. And it is the point of view that if the city is organized to be able to attract the investment and have streamlined processes. And another good point is that these requests will most likely come in bulk. It's not going to be 1 and 2. It might be 10 or 20 or 100 at a time. And the more that it could be, you can organize the guidelines that it is received under, the better the process goes, and then ultimately the more investment is attracted to the city. So the next kind of point to all this is that there are a lot of different companies, technology interests, and just natural infrastructure providers that cities tend to do business with, and those are all represented on the right there. And it is quickly converging that the better wireless master planning you can have and rationalizing how these folks come to your city and do business with your city, what they're allowed to do, where they're allowed to do it, what it's allowed to look like, so that it attracts, again, the right result for you. And what our firm has positioned ourselves a little bit is that we think being neutral is important, being an advocate for the city is important, and then also being organized and planned appropriately so that you can have be ready to receive the requests as it comes along. And this is probably the best summary that I could discuss, is that there's a couple reasons why this should be a priority and this should be something that is top of mind to all cities. Is number one, there's going to be some natural market forces where the private sector is going to want to deploy infrastructure in the city, and then there's the demand side and so forth. And the most important thing about, of course, planning is to be able to maintain control of what the process is. Secondly, it's because it is such a need, and there are rules that both exist at the federal level and some at the state levels, there's going to be also a natural push that whatever negotiation happens, that there be some sort of time certain where people can get answers, they can get guidance, and they can get the process moved along and the results they need. So maintaining control is important, and the best way to maintain control is of course to plan for it. Secondly, and this is a big point from my point of view, is to address the visual blight. when you're going to be deploying 600,000 small cells out there across the U.S., they'll come in all kinds of different looks and forms and configurations. And I know from my experience as a commissioner, we have a very historical city, and it's very, very important that things fit in, they work well, and that the city itself controls the visual blight that can erupt, because the numbers, again, dictate that there's going to be a lot of variability. So having pre-approved form factors about what it's supposed to look like and different variations of that can serve you well. And then, of course, being cost effective. And I'll probably summarize it like this again. There's we believe, a natural competition that will occur on whether these infrastructures get deployed on private property, public property. But at the end of the day, I think it's becoming conventional wisdom that the more prepared cities can be to map out what their assets are, what assets are available or not available because they're prioritized for other things, and then what it can look like, and then some reasonable market costs that need to be recovered to be able to process these needs together. The infrastructure will be deployed a lot more seamlessly, and the investment will take place. On the flip side, there's going to be natural points where the private sector will want to compete with cities, and that's fine too. But I'll give you a really real live example, and it's just a story. We were invited into a large city to look at what their needs were, and private sector deployments of these small cells were going really well in the cities, but they were on top of buildings or they served a certain street corner, and it wasn't getting down to the ubiquitous nature of the residents and the people who were walking on the street. So even though they had great investment, it wasn't balanced between good private investment or public investment. So I look forward to the questions, but the summary here, and appreciate being invited, is I think that the better planning that we can do, the better that we can really inventory and offer what assets might be available, and that the market rates that could be charged for these kind of things, and the more organized we can be as cities, the investment is there, and being certainly ready to take advantage of providing better and great service to your customers. And then lastly, again, for smart city and technology to really work and to really take off, you never want to be investing in an application that would be out there, whether it's smart parking or some other application out there that maybe is 80% reliable because your wireless infrastructure isn't up to par. So as you're contemplating these smart city investments, this again provides the baseline for that, and the planning mechanism is just equally important to other planning mechanisms that happen in the cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Mr. Mayor, you're up.
That's why I love these conferences, because I learn so much, and I'm already seeing ways of working together with these folks. I'm Gary Resnick, as was introduced earlier. I'm with GrayRobinson. I'm located in Florida, and I represent a lot of local governments on these issues in Florida. In fact, today, two of my clients are sending me drafts moratoria to basically delay accepting permits for locating wireless facilities in the rights of way until they adopt regulations that allows for them. So very, very timely topic, and I'm glad that this conference is occurring now so everybody can share information. NATOA always does such a great job of putting all the stakeholders in the room together and trying to at least convey information, if not work out solutions. Just a story, and this is to some extent relevant. My other half and I just got back about a week ago from Iceland, and the country is 90% unpopulated. You see sheep, and that's about it, and yet it has ubiquitous wireless service throughout the entire country. We could be driving and not see another person or a car or a home or a house or a building for 20 miles, no joke, and have constant access to Google Maps. I could put in the name of a waterfall, and it will take me to it. And it's all wireless. They don't have any wireline service in that country, which is phenomenal. I mean, that's the promise of what we can achieve in this country. And, they have incredibly tough climates there, and so they managed to achieve it. So the promise is there with smart planning. Maybe if we only had 300,000 people in an entire country to do it, and it would be easier. And so that's, the population of most of our communities. But also there were some really, really poor examples. We went to this peninsula on the end of the country on the west side, surrounded by oceans on three sides, and the town at the very end of the peninsula called Stikkishulmur something, something, something. You can't pronounce anything in Iceland. Anyone been there? Stikkishulmur in Iceland? I know, so you'll know what I'm talking about. Phenomenally gorgeous physical location, surrounded by water on three sides, mountains, across a fjord from a glacier. You look out in the ocean, you see seals, and they can see whales periodically, and just physically absolutely gorgeous. The highest point in the town is this beautiful church, very awe-inspiring, whether you're religious or not, just physically absolutely gorgeous, with a steeple that was probably 200 feet tall. In the center of the town, where you could see it from every single location, regardless of where you looked, was about a 200-foot tall guide tower for all of their wireless communications. And it was just, the tourist in me was like, wow, this is an absolutely beautiful place, and, is in this incredible views and everything. The telecom lawyer in me was like saying, God, this town got it wrong, and why didn't they just have a regulation that required co-location, because the church steeple was right there, and they could have put all of their wireless devices in the church steeple, and they could have avoided this hideous, ugly tower in the center of town that everybody has to see, regardless of where you look. So I guess the point of the story is, and I should have pictures of it somewhere here, because I took a bunch of pictures of a telecom tower, like an idiot. But the point is that these are permanent locations that we're dealing with. These are permanent facilities. They are not temporary. And so there really does need to be careful planning. If you make a mistake in your community, it will be there for a long, long time. And so there does need to be careful planning, and there does need to take into consideration the future. And so that's kind of where I'm at now with respect to these uses of the rights-of-way, because it's a new technology and it's a new use that has the possibility of being very disruptive. And most local governments, state governments for that matter also, are just not used to it. We don't have a history of dealing with technology for wireless communication services that's primarily wants to be located in our rights-of-way. And so, of course, with new technology, feds, states, and local governments are very cautious because, again, I think people realize, especially planners, because they are visionary and long-term folks, that if you make a mistake, this could have long-term ramifications. The empty, vacant right-of-way that's there now, in 5 years may be a lake or a golf course or a new development or a school or something else. And so you really have to make sure that your land use codes and land use plans are in order before you start contemplating whether to allow these things in the rights-of-way. So there's not a lot of law with respect to use of the rights-of-way for wireless communications devices. There's very, very little Fed law, and there's virtually no state law or local government law. And so from a local government standpoint, if a local government, and a planner will tell you this too, if a local government's code does not allow a facility to be located in a particular location, generally it's denied. If it's not permitted, it's denied. From the federal law standpoint, there's very little federal law that addresses the use of the rights-of-way by wireless communications devices. There's a little bit in Section 6409 of the Spectrum Act, which applies to co-locations. So if there's an existing wireless facility, tower, or base station in the rights-of-way, this statute would apply with respect to co-locating wireless devices on that facility. But because these predominantly do not exist in the rights of way, that doesn't come into play very much. And from the FCC standpoint, the FCC really hasn't adopted any regulations dealing with use of the rights of way by wireless facilities. There's always talk that the FCC will, because of the reasons that Dan indicated, the need for 5G and the use of the rights of way, especially for small cells. But the FCC was recently handed a pretty big defeat by the Sixth Circuit when it tried to preempt state law with respect to municipal broadband. The Sixth Circuit said the federal statute did not expressly give authority to the FCC to preempt state law. And the same is true really with respect to use of the rights of way. State law, and I'll get to that in a minute, state law pretty much governs use of the rights of way. And as far as I know, there's no federal statute that expressly gives authority to the FCC to preempt state law with respect to use of the rights of way. There are distinctions that both federal law and the federal courts have recognized with respect to deploying new facilities, new towers versus co-locations. So there might be some provisions that apply with respect to co-locations, but they don't apply with respect to locating new facilities in the rights of way. So I mentioned before the importance of state law, and this is really where the rubber meets the road, and this is why it's so difficult to come up with a national perspective on this, because state laws vary widely with respect to administration of the rights of way. And you could really look at pretty much every state in the country and there'd be some differences. Just to give you an example, in Florida, that I'm familiar with, the Florida state roads are controlled either by the Florida Department of Transportation or the Florida Turnpike Authority. Two totally separate agencies. They don't have the same rules or regulations. They don't communicate very well together. They're not governed by the same board. They don't report to the same people. So the Florida Turnpike Authority may have one policy and set of directives with respect to use of its rights of way. The Florida Department of Transportation can have an entirely separate set of regulations and policies and rules with respect to use of its rights of way. I will tell you, both state agencies, and this may occur in other states as well, they tend to get their money from the federal government, from the Federal Highway Administration, for transportation projects, which could include constructing conduit and fiber in the rights of way for use for transportation purposes. They will often tell another entity that wants to use that fiber or conduit, whether it be a local government or a private entity, that it cannot be used for communications purposes. It can only be used for transportation purposes, because that's basically what federal law is these days. If the federal government is giving money to a state agency for construction of facilities in the rights of way, pretty much has to be used for transportation. So maybe some other states have gone further with respect to opening that up, or some federal agencies have gone further with respect to opening that up. I know there is one county in Florida now that is trying to enter into an agreement with the Turnpike Authority to use empty conduit that the Turnpike Authority installed to install fiber in that portion of the county so that it could have a fiber network that the county would control using the state's conduit and the fiber network that the county already constructed. But that would be a precedent-setting agreement. And so that's kind of the stage of where this is at. There's not a lot of experience doing these things. Let's see what else. The other thing that's important to mention with respect to Florida, and this is how Florida differs, I think, from every other state in the country. Florida statute prohibits local governments from entering into agreements with providers of communication services for access to the rights of way. Let me say that again. Florida law prohibits local governments from entering into agreements with communication service providers for access to the rights of way. We cannot enter into any type of contract. We cannot enter into any type of franchise, license, whatever you want to call it. We cannot enter into an agreement. And that was something that was heavily lobbied for by the wireline communications industry back when they were building out FiOS and UVerse and all those great things. They didn't want to have to go to the local governments for franchises, so they got the authority to have access to the rights of way without going to local governments for agreements. All sounds well and good, and FiOS and UVerse were built out to some extent. But now, guess what? They want access to the rights of way, and local governments don't have any regulations allowing for it. So they're coming to the local governments. There was a provider here earlier that I met with that would love to enter into an agreement with the local government for access to its rights of way, and Florida law prohibits it. So be careful what you ask for, because in 5 years that may come back to bite you in the you-know-what. So some other aspects of Florida law that these things to some extent mirror federal law. You must treat communications providers in a competitively neutral manner. Florida local governments are not allowed to charge fees for access to the rights of way. Talk about a disincentive to allow companies to come into your rights of way. Florida replaced franchise fees because there's no longer franchises. They've replaced franchise fees with a communication services tax, a CST. And a company will pay a tax based on the revenue received from an end user customer. Tax goes to the Department of Revenue and is distributed back to jurisdictions based on where the end user customer lives. So if I'm, XYZ company and I want to put a cell tower in the right of way to provide backhaul service for a provider of wireless communications, guess how much revenue that local government is going to get for that? Got it, thank you. Yeah, paying attention back there. 0, 0, 0. So there's not a heck of a lot of incentive to work with the industry to locate wireless facilities in the rights of way because there's a zero revenue opportunity. And under state statute, I didn't put this up there, but under state statute, local governments cannot charge permit fees. So the review of these facilities, potentially, under one statute, they can charge permit fees. Under another statute, they can't. So there's a conflict in Florida law. And of course, I would take the position that they can charge permit fees. But there's a potential that if an applicant comes in and applies to locate a 120-foot tower in the rights of way, and there's all kinds of engineering reviews and all kinds of planning reviews and has to go to several boards for consideration, and the city incurs $30,000 on reviewing that application, it can charge 0 in permit fees. So there's an absolute cost to the city, and they cannot get reimbursed for that cost. Let's see what else. So the business plan that 5 Bars had, maybe I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that would work for any Florida local government because we cannot enter into the type of agreement that 5 Bars wants to enter into with local governments and with the providers of service, at least for access to the rights of way. We could do it for public property, for government-owned property, or you could do it for private property. But in terms of use of the rights of way, I think it would be prohibited by state statute as it currently stands. Instead of entering into agreements to get the type of information that you would normally get and the type of protection that a local government in Florida would normally get through an agreement, we can require a registration process. So that's how we get the contact information, the name, phone number, email address, et cetera, of who the contact information is for the provider that wants to be in our rights of way. That's how we know who to contact if there's an emergency. And that's also how we can require insurance and a bond. So it's through a registration process that has to apply to all communication service providers equally. It applies to all providers regardless of who they are or the size of the provider or what they intend to do in the rights of way. And the registration, though, does not convey a property right. It does not give any entity the right to actually build a facility in the rights of way. They still have to apply for a permit. It just creates the authority to apply for the permit to get access to the rights of way. So what's going on now? So that's kind of the framework of the state law in Florida with respect to access to the rights of way for wireless communications facilities. As you hear, it's not very conducive because local governments don't have the experience with it, and they're very cautious because the state statutes primarily don't address it. And the local codes, as a result, don't generally address installation of wireless facilities in the rights of way. Most local codes, land development codes, zoning codes in Florida do address wireless facilities on public property, on private property rather, excuse me. For public property, of course, wireless providers can lease and do lease public property all the time to install towers, wireless facilities, et cetera. Of course, they go in and lease private property all the time, and local codes address where they can be located from a zoning standpoint, have comprehensive regulations involving the construction of such facilities on private property, but they usually have absolutely nothing dealing with the construction of such facilities in the rights-of-way. And so a lot of local governments now, because they've been inundated, as Dan and Karen indicated, with applications to install poles in the rights-of-way. So the answer is our code doesn't allow it, so you're rejected. Or give us time to figure this out, and maybe we'll adopt some regulations that will allow it. And so what local governments are doing is they're adopting moratoria to, basically it's a zoning in progress. For those who are not familiar with moratoria, local governments can adopt a zoning in progress moratoria so that they do not have to move forward with processing these applications until they adopt regulations that would address them. So I've had now about 24 jurisdictions just adopt moratoria in the past 3 weeks, and more are doing so in the next month or so. You have to adopt it by ordinance. It has to go to your city commission or your county commission. So it's a public hearing, it's a process. And what's interesting is the industry, for the most part, including the 2 large trade associations, are supporting the adoption of these moratoria to give local governments the ability to adopt regulations to regulate the use of rights-of-way for wireless communications facilities. Some jurisdictions have had moratoria in place now for 18 months. Fort Lauderdale had a moratorium in place for 18 months and just extended it another year. And they may be getting sued soon. Some other jurisdictions adopted moratoria and then within 6 months or so adopted regulations to govern use of the rights-of-way. It just varies by process depending on what their processes are for moving forward with adopting land use regulations. As the local governments, though, go forward with the actual adoption of regulations, there are a lot of policy concerns and considerations, and these are all things that you're all considering as well as you're considering whether to allow use of these of your rights-of-way for these facilities. Because don't forget, the rights-of-way it's a scarce resource. We're talking about access to rights-of-way, but rights-of-way are used for a tremendous amount of purposes. It's a very, very scarce resource. It's, obviously there's water and sewer, there's electric, there's traffic, pedestrians, there's a ton of users of the rights-of-way. When they were constructed and maintained, it really wasn't thought of that they would be primarily used for wireless communications devices, but that's obviously now another use of the rights-of-way. And so it's a scarce resource, and local governments need to make policy decisions as to whether to open them up for use by wireless communications. And these are policy decisions that go right to the city commission and to the county commissioners. These are not, no disrespect, but these are really not policy decisions for the staff to make. Of course, staff should analyze all of the considerations and all of the concerns and make recommendations and provide helpful information to the policymakers. But this goes to the very heart of local government. Winter Park, where Karen lives, may have very different considerations with respect to use of its rights-of-way than my city of Wilton Manors. And that's the whole beauty of local government. One size doesn't fit all, and local governments have autonomy over the jurisdiction. These are just some of the policy considerations that I listed. Obviously, safety is priority. If it would not be safe to allow use of the rights-of-way, to open them up for use of these facilities, then obviously, that should be the end of the discussion, but that's obviously the number one concern. The other is long-term plans for the rights-of-way. I have a jurisdiction in Palm Beach County that passed a bond. Its voters, surprisingly, it's a wealthy community, but its voters passed the bond to underground all utilities in the city. They're going to spend over $1 million to do it. So after they spend that $1 million, it really wouldn't make sense to build the wireless tower in the rights-of-way after they spend a ton of money to underground everything in the rights-of-way. And there's a lot of reasons in Florida why you'd want to underground all utilities. We have storms and hurricanes and all of those kinds of things, and despite how much the utilities think that they can harden their infrastructure and their network, they're not really hardened. And the only way to really have secure infrastructure, especially during heavy storms, is to underground utilities. So you have to take a look at what your long-term vision is with respect to where you want those utilities to be. The other thing is whether there are the other properties where facilities could be located so that residents and businesses would have the availability of services. If a jurisdiction has a lot of other properties that are available in other zoning districts for use of these, for deployment of these facilities, there may not be a need to open up the rights-of-way to allow those to be located there. Karen talked about visual blight and aesthetics. It's very, very important, as I indicated. If a jurisdiction is very concerned about economic development, about long-term future development, don't discount aesthetics. If you have a whole lot of towers popping up in your rights-of-way, that really may discourage economic development, and it may impact other developments that we're looking at coming into the city. The other thing is a lot of the providers will tell you that, or the infrastructure deployment companies, which are actually two different industries, will tell you that they can construct new poles so that they'll match the height of existing utility poles that are already in the rights-of-way. So from a visual standpoint, it'll look fine, and there won't be any discrepancies, and you won't even notice it. That may be true, but don't forget, under federal law and the 6409 and the FCC's regulations, they can increase the height of an existing tower 20% to co-locate additional facilities. So they may come in at 50 feet or 35 feet or whatever is currently the height of existing poles, but under federal law, they have the right, you don't have to approve it, they have the right to increase the height by 20%. So it may, in 2 years, no longer be the 35-foot or 50-foot pole that they originally constructed. So you have to take that into consideration as well. I mentioned the other users of the rights-of-way and whether they can actually just physically accommodate wireless facilities in the rights-of-way. Talked about the costs incurred by local government to permit those facilities. As I indicated in Florida, it's questionable whether they can be reimbursed for those costs. And then the ability to regulate in light of federal law with respect to the increases in height, and also replacement. Under federal law, they have the right to replace facilities in any wireless facility to accommodate co-location and increase the height. So these facilities that are constructed in the rights-of-way are going to be permanent, they can be replaced, and they can be increased in height. So you really have to make a determination that use of the rights-of-way is something that you're going to allow on a permanent nature, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about 5 or 10 years. We're talking about a facility that's going to be located there probably 50, 75 years. So it's careful planning. What's interesting is this discussion that we're having in Florida has led to a lot of input from the industry, which is great. We always rather have a dialogue than be adversarial and just regulatory. And so there was kind of an unholy alliance created of, this is interesting. So it's AT&T, both wireless and wireline, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, Crown Castle, Hotwire, and Comcast got together and have now started submitting. They prepared a draft ordinance for all of these local governments that are adopting moratoria to come up with regulations for access to the rights-of-way for wireless communications facilities. And mobility, of course, was not part of that unholy alliance. I don't know why. And there's some interesting things about the draft ordinance. It does steer, for the most part, it steers wireless facilities to co-location on existing facilities in the rights-of-way, as opposed to building new poles or towers. As you can imagine, the review is not exactly what most local governments would want from a review standpoint. I think it's subject to approval by the assistant to the growth management department or something like that. It's a pretty easy review and not very time-consuming either. And there's, of course, no permit fees, because they take the position that Florida prohibits permit fees. and it would allow full modification of any facilities that they install without any government local review. But at least it's a start. You know, we can take a look at what they've submitted and look at how we want to use that for purposes of amending our regulations. So I guess just the takeaways is, you know, not every jurisdiction is the same, that the good laws do take into consideration local concerns, and that these have to be long-term resolutions because these towers are going to be in place 50 to 75 years. If you ever happen to go to Stikkeshumer, whatever it's called, Iceland, take a look at the tower and let me know if it's still there. I guarantee it's still going to be there. And you're going to say the same thing I did. Say, wow, what an absolutely beautiful place. Isn't it a shame that that tower is in the middle of the city? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary. So if it isn't obvious, since we started a little late, given the lunch going a little late, we're going to go a little longer, I think maybe 3:30, depends on the questions. I have just a couple footnotes. One, many of the advisors that you know or have met here at NATOA are steeped in these issues, and because of timelines and penalties and all kinds of things that the FCC in particular has promulgated, it is critical when you receive one of these applications that you deal with it. And they don't always come in an obvious way. Seek out special counsel and any of the folks here or out there in the audience. The law that Gary's talking about, there have been efforts across the country by the wireless industry, not surprisingly, because now they're the thing of the moment. And so they've been trying to streamline, which means kick us out of the way. California just beat a law that was being proposed there. In Michigan, we're fighting the automobile industry that's trying to get their own particular brand of wireless in the right-of-way. And by the way, we don't want any local intervention. So we're fighting that. So you got to watch that, so watch your capital. I should note that there is a 2014 FCC order that talks about this at great length, 150 pages, 750 footnotes. I don't encourage you to read it, but I encourage you to talk to somebody who has. So that, because the industry has read it, I assure you. Let's see. Moratoria, just a quick note. There are timelines. Some of you have state law that establish timelines. The federal law certainly establishes timelines for new cell towers and co-locations, and these apply probably to things in your right-of-way, or you have to at least assume that. So you need to know what those are. 30 days is the short one for letting the industry know that your application is incomplete. So 30 days, think 30 days. That's the shortest timeline in the bunch. Maybe it doesn't apply, but assume it does. Just like I said, a couple footnotes. So I have a couple questions for our speakers, and since I'm here, I get to go first. Let's see, Dan.
Yes.
Have you seen any of the applications from Mobility, not to pick on anyone, for 120-foot utility posts? I'm struggling. Right next to the right-of-way. Have you seen those, Dan? And do you have any thoughts on that? Because you did say that these are not macro towers.
The answer is I have not seen those applications, and I'm glad I haven't seen them.
I have your email. You're going to.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll take a look at it, and then I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah. How many have seen a 120-foot tower application for your right-of-way? Yeah. Well, the rest of you will be raising your hand 6 months from now, because Mobility, who's working on behalf of Sprint, is out there working very hard, just like the rest, to get in the right-of-way. And then, let's see, Karen, I was asked by a group of cities on the west side of our state to bring together, it was an obvious kind of question, bring together all of these wireless folks, let's find out what they all need together, and we'll build a master wireless plan. They must have been listening to you. Are you successful in doing that?
Well, yes, we've been very successful, and I'll tell it with a story. The city of Sacramento, which I had referred to, of course, it's a state capital, and they had been receiving a lot of requests. They had a economic event in their downtown. They're building a new stadium. They have some gentrification. They've done a lot of investment, and so they were receiving a lot of inquiries. They hired 5 bars, and I'll preface it by saying this has been evolutionary. And we're a 3-year-old company in this space, and it's changed over the last 18 months. It's just, quite frankly, gotten faster. More is coming, and it's coming more complicated. So what Sacramento had done prior to engaging with us is they brought all the carriers together in a 6-month process, and they sat around the table. They all worked with each other. They had public works and real estate and IT and all the carrier operations and different wireless planners. And the entire process after that many months fell apart, and most of the folks had gone home discouraged and upset by it. And the lesson learned there was that the city themselves needed to be clear about what their process was going to be, because parts of the decision making sat in public works, some sat in real estate, who owned the poles, some sat in utilities, some sat in IT. And so the city of Sacramento went back and organized their own approach. Of course, they hired us to do a lot of it, but there were key decisions that they had to come to be able to receive both the requests, the advice, and the input from the carriers. So it's been a good process, certainly for 5 bars, but preceding our involvement is exactly what happened, and it didn't work. And there were a lot of different reasons, but some of the reasons are what I described, that the city themselves had to figure out who owned what part of the decision. And sometimes that's very unclear until you get in the room and you discuss, does the utility division own some decisions over the poles? Who owns the street furniture? What about the buildings? And probably the last piece that I would say there is that when Gary was speaking about right-of-way, that is definitely a big consideration in this whole puzzle. What we've advocated for with cities is that organize the public assets in a way that can be attractive and pleasing so that those assets can be marketed, which may be completely different than the right-of-way, because cities own a lot of different assets other than the right-of-way. And you may not, as Gary said, want to have things in your right-of-way, but you may. But as a huge alternative, the city assets being available is going to be highly advantageous.
Our experience was the inability to get the providers together in the same room because they don't get along all that well with each other.
No, they don't.
Our Madam President, you have a question.
Mostly for Karen, but it occurs to me that many of our NATOA members who are used to coming to this conference, in many of our jobs, we're not as familiar with working with the wireless side of things, because we think of ourselves as cable administrators, or we deal with the rights of way, but there might be someone else in the city staff who works with the, and I fear that, at least in my small and middle-sized suburbs in Minneapolis, St. Paul, they probably are being undercompensated for their assets. And I don't know if part of your work that you do is to look at market research to educate the local governments about what appropriate market rates they should be getting for their own assets. And I don't know exactly how you study that, but I think you'd have to look at similar communities in your state and maybe even in other parts of the country that are similar types of real estate and demographics and so forth. So that's one piece, and just a reminder for all of us that, again, it's bringing down the silos within our cities and understanding why we need to understand and bring this information back to the other departments who aren't here.
Yeah, and that is a great question. That is a cornerstone of what 5 Bars does. The recommendation, and of course, we just believe in local control, and the recommendation of based on the market rate, based on the assets that you have available. And also, it's just not what the wireless carrier can attach to. It's the fiber that's in the ground. Maybe there's pieces and parts, there's conduit, there's different cities have different configurations with their utilities. Some are owned utilities, some are partnerships. And so that's absolutely what we do in recommendation. Secondly, if there is a change in the ordinance that needs to happen, we recommend what that needs to be. And in the case of the city of Sacramento, what they decided to do based on our recommendation was to, I'm going to generalize, but to basically exempt their city-owned assets from what was an older historical telecom ordinance, so that they could price them the way that would be attractive to the investment, recover the costs that were necessary, streamline a process where multiple applications could be approved at an administrative level in the city that were already pre-planned, and to make the process be straightforward. So that is the part and parcel, the work that we did with them. And the last comment I would make is the point of view of how we went at this is that, because again, I live in my city, I'm a resident, I have a small business, I'm in a little bit of the metropolis where there's schools and so forth. Ubiquitous coverage and density is the goal for everybody, for the private side, the public side, the resident side, and so forth. And what we did is said, we're going to do an RF study of the entire city. And every frequency, every carrier, we're going to lay that on top of what the city wants to offer in their assets, come up with the pricing mechanisms that make sense to be able to do the business together, figure out what has to be discounted for other uses, public safety or whatever it is, and provide, this is the biggest one, provide alternatives. Because the rules that are coming from the government, either state or federal and so forth, if you're prepared with a map of saying you can go here, here, and here, this is the way we'd like to look at it, here's the price that needs to be, this is the process that falls within that 30 or 60 days, and if the industry is coming and proposing something that is contrary to what your plan is, the biggest defense that you have is to provide the alternative. I know you want to go here, but a block away or 2 blocks away, it will service your needs. Here's engineering studies to back it up, and this is what we have to offer. And as long as you can provide an alternative, you're in a great position to provide guidance. And so that's been the kind of the cornerstone of where we've come at it.
Okay, next
I
question.
just add one little thing to that too. What one of the cities that I represented is that it's a city that generally had a dislike for towers, like most cities did, because it was a bedroom community, a lot of gated homeowner associations within the city, didn't really have space for towers. They had one area that was actually city-owned property where they thought the city commission would approve a tower, and they came up with a plan of issuing an RFP to the various infrastructure entities as well as the providers. And the commission blessed it before it went out and saying, look, we have this space, here's where it's located, happened to be very, very close to a major highway, so it was a place where there was a drop in coverage. And we will consider leasing this to highest, best, most responsive bidder that wants to construct a tower there, and it has to provide for co-location and those types of things. And that actually really worked. They wound up generating about $250,000 a year from the tower on their property, and it provided coverage in that area. So that's another approach you might want to take.
Okay, question, please.
Good afternoon. My name's Gabriel Garcia. I'm with CPS Energy in San Antonio. That's the electric and gas utility owned by the city. I have a question for Dan and Gary. I need a clarification. So under the FCC, shot clock regulations, what I'm hearing is that if the city approves a permit, that structure becomes subject to co-location. Am I hearing that if the electric utility grants through a pole attachment agreement access to their pole for a wireless installation. And we are not granting a permit. It's the city granting a permit. If they are, I'm not sure, that our electric utility pole becomes subject to automatic co-location, and we lose control of our infrastructure. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's not what I've heard. Where are you hearing this information?
That's actually not, I'm sorry, that's actually not the FCC regs. The FCC regs, which local governments were very involved in providing input on, provide that they do not apply to government-owned property that's owned in its proprietary nature as opposed to regulatory nature. So in other words, if there's a municipal park or a municipal-owned pole that a facility wants to attach to, the regulations, the shot clocks, et cetera, don't apply to processing an agreement to locate on that type of government-owned property. At least that's my understanding of the FCC regs, that they don't apply to you
Just a
as an
second.
owner of that property.
Mike?
Dan, did you want to
Steve
finish?
says we have to absolutely be at a hard stop, so we will need to let people continue the conversation, but we need to let people leave who would like to leave.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'll
Folks,
follow up.
come on
with
up if you have questions.
Yeah.
I guess we're done, right?
Yeah. Right. Well,
Thank you, sir.